So in this session, I'd like to speak about the journey of meditation. There are many ways in which we can describe a journey. It's important, I think, to have this metaphor, this idea of meditation as a journey, because it helps us to approach it, to approach the experience of our practice in the right way, and to describe it, to communicate it in a way that is helpful to people when they're beginning. I'm sure you, like me, and most people when they begin to meditate, are waiting for something to happen. You expect that there's going to be a dramatic turning point, a dramatic event in the meditation itself. You're suddenly going to see something that you hadn't seen before. You're going to have an experience that you haven't known before. You're going to have some knowledge that you didn't have before. And you can identify that experience, or that vision, or that knowledge as progress. But that's not what it's like. And so in the first stages of learning to meditate, we have to reevaluate what we mean by the experience of meditation. Father John says that in meditation nothing happens, and if something does happen, ignore it. Now, a lot of people don't quite understand what he means, but I think you know what he means. It means that we're not coming to meditation looking for some dramatic or special or extraordinary experience. We're not looking for something supernatural to happen, some direct, dramatic communication from God. We may be expecting that. We may not know what to expect, and so we may feel confused about what should be happening. And people often ask, what am I supposed to be feeling? Or what should I be experiencing? I feel confused. And this is very normal, very natural, and when people say that to you, you should say yes. Okay? I had the same feeling, everybody has the same experience. It's described in The Cloud of Unknowing when he says that you feel disorientated when you start meditating, moving into this experience of contemplation. He says you don't quite know which direction you're going, and you can't say what is up or what is down, what is left or right. It's a different set of coordinates. Some years ago I was flying in a small plane, and I was sitting next to the pilot, and he said to me, "Would you like to fly the plane?" So I said, yes. Why did you stay sitting next to me? And so I took the controls. I mean, he was controlling it really, but he let me pretend I was flying it. And then we went into a cloud, and I got quite panicky for a moment, because I had no idea what was up, what was down, what was left or right. And in a moment, I'd lost all sense of direction, even basic up and down. I didn't know whether we were upside down even. So that really was the cloud of unknowing. So there is that experience that we have to be prepared for, and when you're teaching meditation to people, help to prepare them for that. Now, you can't really prepare them, they have to meet this experience themselves, but then you can encourage them and say, you know, that's okay, that's what you should be feeling. And this is expressed sometimes when people say, you know, I want to meditate, but I don't feel that it's prayer, because it's not prayer as I'm used to praying. So it's very important then, I think, that we approach meditation as a journey as a process rather than a state that we have to achieve or an experience that we have to make happen. And it's only experience, really, it's only practice, it's only time that will help us to understand this. But it's something we have to discover for ourselves, but it's important to be prepared for it. So, and this is really consistent with the gospel itself. Jesus describes himself as a way, or as a door, or as life, not as an object. You know, he doesn't say, come and build a statue of me and bow down in front of the statue and worship the statue, or worship the image. In the resurrection appearances, he appears to people in normal circumstances of life, but at first they don't recognize him. When they do recognize him, he disappears from their sight. But they are changed by this experience, and they go back to their ordinary lives and live life in a new way. So really, our experience of meditation is an interior experience of what the whole of the Christian life is about. A process of change, of conversion, of transformation, of transfiguration in Christ. St. Paul says at the beginning of the letter to the Romans that the gospel is a way of salvation. A way of salvation. Salvation, we could translate that as healing, or integration, or becoming one, becoming whole. So the gospel is a way of life, a way of salvation that begins in faith and ends in faith. So it's open-ended. Faith is about being open to something other than ourselves, something new, something that we cannot explain or control. So it's open-ended at both ends, at the beginning of the way and at the end of the way. And that's also a good way for us to understand meditation, a way of faith. We begin in faith, and we don't come to any point where we say, I've arrived, I've achieved something, I've mastered something, I know everything. So I emphasize this because this approach to meditation and teaching it will help you and the people that you teach to make the journey, to get into the journey and to persevere with it. Most people give up simply because they don't really understand that this is the nature of the experience, the nature of the way. They think that it's something they should be getting, something they should be achieving. But the secret is life itself. The secret is the whole process and the journey. Now, there are different ways that we can describe this journey, and in the Christian mystical tradition, many of the great teachers have given us different pictures, different maps. You know, when you arrived at Hong Kong airport, you were a bit disoriented maybe. You try to follow the signs, or you may have to ask for directions. You may feel a little anxious about getting to the hotel, but whether it's by shuttle or by taxi or by some other way, and so on. So it's when we begin a new journey, we often feel a little nervous. We don't know the way, we don't know the directions. This is what one of the apostles said to Jesus. Lord, we don't know the way. What is the way to the Father? And Jesus says, I am the way. So, but when we begin the practice of meditation, we have to be prepared for this feeling of uncertainty, or that it's difficult for us to explain it or imagine it or picture it or know what to expect. So it's very helpful for us to be grounded in the tradition, and from that great tradition we can find many helpful guides, many helpful teachers who can give us directions and help us to get to the right approach and to get going in the journey in the right way. So let me just share with you a few of these ideas or these pictures that describe the experience of meditation, and I'll end with one that describes the different levels of consciousness. But what I was going to begin with was an idea, a very basic idea of the journey of human development. Meditation is something very natural. We see with children how natural meditation is. They like to meditate, and they ask if they can meditate. It's something they appreciate and enjoy. So it's natural. John Main says meditation is as natural to the spirit as breathing is to the body. So we were doing Qigong this morning. There were some certain formal exercises, but I think we had a sense too, this is natural. We're not putting any unnatural pressure on the body or on the mind, but we are doing an exercise, or a series of exercises, like forms of prayer, but they are natural and allow the natural process to unfold in the best possible way. So we can see meditation in relationship to very basic human development. The fact that children can meditate tells us something about this relationship between meditation and human development, psychological development, personal development. We used to think that contemplative prayer was a very high level for a very few people. That it was something that contemplative nuns or monks or mystics were capable of, but not ordinary people. In the seminaries, priests were told that if they were interested in contemplation, they should go to a monastery, because they were, they were not being trained for this kind of thing. And lay people, especially, apart from a very, very few exceptions, lay people were told just to pray, come to Mass, say the Rosary, do your devotions, but don't expect to reach high level of contemplation, because you can't do that as a layperson. And there are many Buddhist abbots and teachers who would say the same thing, that in order to meditate seriously, you have to be a monk. So this is no Catholic or Christian understanding. But in recent years, we have rediscovered the meaning of contemplation as part of the Christian experience of faith. And we now realize that, in fact, the teaching of Jesus on prayer, which I described yesterday, applies to everybody, and that it is a teaching of contemplation. So it's something that should be part of our journey, of the way of life, the journey of life that God gives us. And so it's understandable then that children can meditate. We find children of 4 years old can meditate, and that at every year of their development they will be developing through meditation and with meditation. Meditation will accompany them. I don't know how young children learn to do Qigong. What age would you first teach a child to do Qigong?
小孩做气功的，我不知道，3、4岁可以就练体操啦，练那些体操运动员那些练。
Interesting. 3 or 4 years old, so they're at the same age. So, and yet you wouldn't say that a 3-year-old is a Qigong master, but they know how to do it. So in the same way, they can learn to meditate. So we now, I think, are beginning to understand that meditation and the contemplative dimension of our faith is there from the beginning of the journey. Okay. Some time ago I was I was visiting a school, and there were young children, maybe about 5 years old, 6 years old. And I was wearing my habit, my white habit, that I wore for Mass yesterday. And as I arrived in the classroom, the children began to prepare for the meditation. They created this little circle on the floor where they sit and meditate. But there was one little girl, about 6 years old, who was just staring at me. She had never seen anybody dressed like me, so she was just staring like that. And as the other children were busy, she was just sitting there staring at me, and I said, "Hello, what's your name?" And she didn't reply, she just stared at me. And then, anyway, after a few minutes, she looked at me and she said, "Are you an angel?" And I didn't know how to answer. I thought, she's the angel. Now, a few minutes later, we were sitting next to each other on the floor, meditating. I meditated at the stage of development I had reached. She was meditating at the stage of development she was at, where she still thought that an angel might come into the room and visit the class. In this age of where you have this kind of imagination, this mythology and this imagination. Now, I'm sure she was closer to God than I was, but I was further along the stages of human development than she was. We could meditate together. We each meditate together at the stage of development that we've reached. And we can't really measure that in ordinary terms, but we can, in the light of this understanding of meditation as a way of human development, we can see that it connects with a major aspect of human development, and that is the journey of consciousness. A few days ago, I was with a friend of mine who's just had a baby, and the baby was 9 days old. This tiny little, like a little prawn, and it was, of course, very. It had its eyes closed most of the time. It was the center of attention. Everybody in the room was paying attention to this little piece of consciousness. Now, was that baby conscious? Probably, well, it was alive, so it was conscious. It expressed pain or dissatisfaction, and sometimes it looked very content and peaceful. But it certainly wasn't self-conscious. And the psychologists say that the ability even for the baby to identify anything outside of itself takes some time. I don't know how many weeks or months. But certainly at birth, the baby is not able to distinguish itself as a separate being. It still thinks that it's in the womb. It's bonded so much to the consciousness of the mother. That's why the mother naturally wants to hold it all the time. But there's a certain moment in the development of consciousness when a baby, you know, when I looked at the baby just looked through me. I could see, I knew the baby I wasn't in a relationship with the baby, except just by holding it. But there's a certain moment when the baby will be able to focus on my gaze. So we could really start speaking about the gaze of consciousness. The look. In several places in the Gospel, Jesus looks at people. He doesn't just look at them, he looks into them and changes their life by the way he looks at them. Like the rich young man who wanted to know how to inherit eternal life, and Jesus said, you have to give up everything you have. And Jesus looked at him and loved him. So in Eastern traditions, sometimes the guru initiates the disciple just by a look. So there seems to be, in the way human consciousness develops, a moment where the child is able to look and respond to the gaze, the loving gaze of the mother, or the adult, particularly the mother. And there's a moment where the child knows that it is being looked at and looks at the mother and recognizes the mother. And that moment actually, according to some researchers, brings about a chemical change, hormonal change in both the child and the mother. So it's an actual moment where something gets released, some hormone gets activated when this connection, very simple but very deep connection, takes place at a personal level. Now, at first the child is still is able to gaze and return the gaze, but its level of consciousness is still pretty much involved with that of the mother. But then what happens at about, I mean, you who have children, correct me if I'm wrong, but round about the age of 2, the child begins to separate. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. So at about the age of 2, the child begins to separate and say no. I was once in an airport line watching this poor mother. She had 3 children. She was on her own, and there was one little 2-year-old boy who was terrible. He was a horrible child, and he was tired and he was unhappy and he was disobedient and he would run around screaming, and she would try to make him come back, and he would hit her, you know. So this is the beginning of the ego. The ego says, I am me. I am not you. This is really the function of the ego in human development, to allow a separation to take place. It's painful for everybody. Separation is always painful, and all kinds of separation leave a mark, leave a wound. I don't think it's possible to go through human development which involves separation without being hurt. Now, you can be very badly hurt, or you can, you know, there are different levels and degrees of this experience, but there is pain and there are wounds involved in human development just because of this process of separation. And of course it goes on not only from the womb to the outside world, or from the mother into more independent activity and the ability to negate, to say no, to push away. But then in adolescence, the separation goes to another stage, and then at many stages of life, we have to face the reality of separation. In order to grow, in order to mature, we have to leave father and mother and family. There has to be a separation, not a rejection, but a separation has to take place in order for our own mature identity to develop. If we can't separate from our mother and father and brothers and sisters and develop a mature identity of our own, then we can never make relationships of our own as well. So the function of the ego is related to the perception of ourselves as separate. This is painful, and that's why in the early stages of life, of childhood, we need so much protection. We need the unconditional love of the mother and the father and the brothers and sisters, if they're there, so that we can experience this development, this separation, and endure the pain that it brings us, while feeling that it's okay, that we are accepted and respected as independent, separate identities. Okay. Now, at the same time, as this ego consciousness develops, and it's necessary that it develops, we become more conscious, and we become conscious of the true self. This becomes quite powerful, of course, in adolescence. An adolescent is discovering his or her identity. Who am I really? What is, they're trying out different identities, and they are very much in search of themselves through relationship and through new kinds of experience. So the understanding or the experience of the true self, who am I really, accompanies this experience of separation. It's quite a paradox, because the experience of the true self, as and if it develops, is quite different from that of the ego. The ego is me, separate from everything and everyone else. But the true self is much more an experience of we, of communion, of relationship, of harmony, and eventually, of course, of love. So these two centers of consciousness awaken simultaneously and need each other, in fact, if they are to develop, if this process of human development is to unfold. And the circumstances of our lives, whether we have loving parents, whether we have suffered a great loss very early in life, very early in our lives, whether our parents are capable of giving us unconditional love, and so on. All of these are important factors in how this particular story of our own life unfolds. The basic pattern is the same for all human beings, but every human being, even identical twins born into the same family, they're going to have different stories, different identities. So here's a very simple, but I think true understanding of the journey of life from undifferentiated identity, where we don't know who we are, we just think we're the same as our mother, to a sense of being separate, and then to a new sense that we are indeed unique, but we are not isolated. This is what we mean by the true self. I'm unique. God only has made one of me, but I am not isolated. I belong in relationship. Now, that relationship, that sense of relationship, has to mature in adolescence. Adolescent is trying out different identities. He or she knows that they are changing, their relationships are changing. They have very passionate, intense relationships, but then they change very quickly, painfully, usually. Every adolescent has his or her heart broken several times. So this separation is happening as the ego learns to relate to the true self and allow the true self to develop. So it's as if the ego is a kind of medium or a vehicle. Actually, the Sanskrit word for ego is ahankara. The aham means the I, the true self, and kara is the word that gives us carriage or car. It's a vehicle. So the ego is the sort of the vehicle that allows the true self to develop, to be transported. So we need a healthy ego. Now the ego, of course, is, because of its involvement in the experience of separation, is accumulating many memories of pain. Indeed, of great pain, of great loss. Many broken hearts, many broken or lost relationships. Even in an ideal life, the ego is still going to be associated with pain. Freud said that the ego is the source of all suffering, maybe for different reasons from this, but it's probably true, I think. So, at a certain stage in this journey, we become aware that I am not my ego. That's a very important moment in our maturity. That might mean, for example, say for a priest. A priest develops certain identities. As a priest, has certain functions, he wears certain clothes at certain times, okay? Or a mother who has a certain identity, his relationship to the family and to the children, or a businessman, you know, who has a job and a title and a salary and power in a hierarchy. So the ego develops certain identities. We identify ourselves with those identities, but then we begin to realize, we should begin to realize, I am not this particular role of that I'm identified with. I am not my ego. The ego is not a bad thing. The ego is not bad in itself. But it has many characters, many identities. And we eventually realize cannot be fully identified with any of those. And it doesn't mean that you are not a priest, or a businessman, or a mother, or a father. But you say, I can't be fully explained, I can't be fully identified with any one of those particular roles. And this is a moment of contemplative awakening. This is where we begin to realize the great question of all religion: who am I? Who am I? The only person who knows who he is God. God reveals himself to Moses as I am. That's it. Moses says to God in the burning bush, what is your name? If you tell me who your name is, then I can go to Pharaoh and ask for the liberation of my people. But if you don't give me your name, I don't know who to use, whose name to use. And God says, I'm not giving you a name. The one who's speaking to you is the one who is. I am who I am. So, God, in a sense, is pure I. There is no ego. Certainly in the human sense, there's no ego in the divine being. And the extraordinary thing is, in our biblical revelation, and this is present in all religions in different ways, is that we are capable of knowing this being. We are capable of experiencing this state of being. And in fact, at the heart of all religion is the intuition that we can be who we are, free from all the different roles and names associated with the ego. So this is that little 4-year-old child who meditated with me, thought I was an angel, I don't think was asking that question. But she can meditate at the stage of development that she's reached. But at a certain stage in her development, she's going to begin to say, who am I? It's going to be a struggle. Nobody comes to the experience of their true self without suffering, without the struggle to separate from separation. The ego, remember, is the process of separation and individuation, and it therefore it involves pain, and we have to go through the ego. We can't destroy the ego. If you try to destroy the ego, you will only, it's like bombing a city. You can't, you won't win. You don't win by bombing and destroying a city. What? Blasting, yes, okay, we're writing a book on blasting. So we can't destroy the ego, we have to go through it. And this is why meditation is difficult. No one said this is easy. I mean, who here has never had suffering? Doubt, mistakes, pain. Whether you meditate or not, you will have suffering. And if you try to avoid the reality of this human journey, you just create other kinds of suffering. If you try to avoid the suffering of life by alcohol or other kinds of addiction, or by identifying yourself totally with the ego in the search for power or money or anything else as a substitute or as a way of escape, you only increase your suffering. We learn that by painful experience. If we're lucky, we have a good family and a good culture to grow up in, then maybe we can avoid some of those big mistakes. But we all have to learn from painful experience that we have to go through the ego, even with the pain that it has accumulated, in order to find out who I am. So, here's a very basic picture of the human journey, from the ego, with its sense of separateness, being self-enclosed, and to the true self, which is where there is this experience of being, there is a knowledge of who I am, but it is open-ended in all directions. And ultimately, this leads us into the experience of God, the fullness of being. So Paul says, I pray that you may come to being, come to the fullness of being, the fullness of God Himself. I pray that you may come to the fullness of being, the fullness of God Himself. In the Christian understanding, this whole process, this whole journey, is called divinization, theosis. The Christian mystical tradition says that the purpose of life is to be fully and unconditionally sharing in the being of God. It begins with that unconscious moment of the child becoming conscious, developing an ego, realizing I am not my ego, moving from the ego to a discovery of the true self. This is the spiritual dimension of life, we call it. And it is here that we really begin to understand what meditation means. And it is here, at this stage, at a certain stage, we will accept the uncertainty of meditation, because the unknowing quality of meditation. Because we say, I am prepared to sit here for 20 minutes and do everything I can to let go of my ego. Because I know I am not my ego. I am not the role that I have in the church, or in my family, or in the society, or in my fantasy. All of these are part of me, and I must be responsible to them, but I cannot be fully identified with those. Or I cannot, and this is very important, because if you have an ego identification, let's say you're as a parent, the mystical journey for people who have children, I can't fully appreciate it, but I can imagine it well enough. And I think it's a very definite mystical journey, because as a parent, you bond so totally with the child, and then you have to allow the child to separate. You have to provide the protective circumstances for the child to become an ego and reject you. And one of the great dark nights of the mystical life of the parent is an adolescence, when the child turns against you on many occasions and rejects you. And then you build a new relationship with the child, free from the identification of the ego that you have as a parent. You have to say, I hear this all the time from parents who are talking with their adult children, I have to just listen. I can't tell them what to do. This is painful, because you may want to tell them what to do, or you may want to save them from suffering, or you want to help, but you realize that this is an independent person as well. There's still love, there's still connection, but you have to let go. What you're letting go of is not just the child who you want to control and possess, You have to let go of your own ego image as a parent, or that earlier image of yourself as a parent. So, now it's different from, obviously for different people how this unfolds. But it's the same journey. It's the same journey. So, meditation allows us at a certain level, a certain moment in our conscious maturity to say, I know I am not any of the masks or any of the images or characters of my ego self, my ego identity. And therefore, in meditation, I can concentrate wholeheartedly on who I am. That sounds very narcissistic, but of course it isn't. You'll meet Christians who will say this is very selfish, self-centered. You know, looking for who I am sounds very selfish, but it's not. It's quite the opposite of selfishness. The selfishness is remaining in the closed world of the ego identity. That's selfishness. To break out of that, to die to the ego, this is death. This is a real experience of death. Is the most unselfish thing we can do. This is why Jesus says, you cannot follow me to where he is in his true self and in God. You cannot follow me on this journey of human development unless you leave self behind, what it means to the ego behind. So this is what you're doing when you meditate. As you let go of your thoughts, your words, your imagination, you are making this journey. You're letting go of the ego and moving into this new way of being, which is the true self, and ultimately into the life of God. It is here that we come to self-knowledge. Jesus says in the Gospel of John, I know where I have come from, and I know where I am going. That's a great statement. I know who I am. And Jesus, to put it in simple terms, wants us to know who we are. He wants me to know who I am. He wants you to know who you are in the same way. That's his desire. That's his love for us. Just as a parent wants the child to become a full human being, even if that costs a lot of pain. So God wants us to become who we really are and to know ourselves. And therefore, in the Christian mystical tradition, self-knowledge is the goal. One of the Desert Fathers says, self-knowledge is more important than the ability to work miracles. In the contemplative understanding of prayer, we are not remaining in the closed world of the ego, concentrating upon our sufferings, our desires, and our fears, and our own little private world. We're breaking out of that, and we are breaking out into self-knowledge, the knowledge of the true self, which is what we call the experience of being. It's not thought, this is an experience. It's actually an experience of love. It's about loving yourself and loving God. So self-knowledge is the basis of our knowledge of God. We cannot know God unless we know ourselves in this way at a much deeper level than the ego. We cannot know God through the ego, because the ego makes itself the center of reality. That's what we mean by an egotistical person. That's why egocentric people are so boring and maybe dangerous, because everything revolves around themselves. A young German woman who became one of Hitler's secretaries during the war, escaped at the end of the war, and she just died a few years ago. And she never spoke about her experience of working with Hitler. But until just before she died, she gave an interview. And somebody asked her, was he an evil man? And she said, well, no, I wouldn't say that he was an evil man. Obviously he did evil things. But she said he could be quite kind. And, you know, he liked animals, and he liked children. He could be quite gracious at times. But she said he was the most egotistical person she had ever met or could ever imagine. Everything revolved around himself. And therefore he didn't really have a true identity. That seems to have been the secret of Hitler's strange psyche. Anyway, as long as, and we can remain trapped in the ego of our prayer. Our prayer can be very egocentric. Our image of God can be very egocentric because we place ourselves at the center of our relationship with God. I am the center of the universe and God revolves around me. So I will tell God to do this, I will ask God to do that, I will get some certain satisfaction by speaking to God in this way. So God is there for me. But that's not real. That's bad religion and it's bad psychology. And so the natural process of human development is pushing us away from that. There's some gravity, there's some force of nature that pushes us away from the ego, to break out of the ego and into the true self. And it's only as we come into self-knowledge that we can really begin to know the true God. Not God of our imagination or the God of our desire. And this is why St. John of the Cross says, when we pray in contemplation, we let go of all desire, even the desire for God. What that means is, we let go of the egotistical desire for God. God as something or someone we can possess and control. It's like a possessive parent trying to possess the child. So we have to break out of that. And meditation makes sense. The reason that we meditate, even though it is difficult at times, is because at the deepest level of our identity, we know that meditation is helping us to complete this journey. It gives us an extra energy and an extra focus to leave the ego behind and to expand in this dimension of the true self. So here's one way of looking at that. I think this is longer than I completed. What time do we finish? 10:30. Okay. Well, let's. There's another couple of ways I would like to try to describe the journey of meditation. This is a more psychological one, but it's a theological one too. Meditation helps us to understand how psychology relates to theology.